So over here we talk about adaptations a lot, usually through the lens of book-to-screen translations or occasionally book-to-stage. Today we're going to look at it through a slightly different lens while looking at the book Selling the Dream, The $1 Million Industry Bankrupting Americans by Jane Marie. Now, this name may sound familiar to you if you are familiar with anti-MLM content, because this book is in fact looking at the MLM industry. And if you have been with me for a second, I have expressed an interest in these kind of examinations, whether it be from Cultish or last year's Hey Hun. But if we rewind past all of the YouTube videos and all of the documentaries, we will find ourselves, or I will find myself back at this start of this journey of really being interested in MLMs because of their overlap of kind of scam and cult. At the beginning, the Dream podcast, Jane Marie's podcast, was one of the first places I found that really articulated things about this industry that as an individual I had been aware of, but hadn't really seen or heard articulated through a wider lens. And so I was very, very excited about this book because I have recommended the first season of the Dream podcast so many times, and my friends could tell you that I have been very interested in this kind of idea of MLMs for a long time. Now, I don't talk about it more widely as often because I think it is a really delicate area. These business models are inherently predatory, but this doesn't often mean that the people roped into these companies are stupid or bad people. It just means that these companies have been pitched to people in a way that makes them hopeful and makes them think that they have an opportunity for success that doesn't really exist. So let's rewind a little bit, because this examination is going to go into the book and be a review of the book, but I'm going to have to talk about the subject matter a lot more than I generally do in these Future Fridays. And I don't really do nonfiction books all that often because of that, but I have been interested in this for so long. I really do feel like I know what I'm talking about to some extent here, but at the same time, that is something that I'm bringing to the table in my perception of this book, and we will get into a little bit more of that later. But let's kind of just level ourselves here and talk about what an MLM even is. You know them, even if you don't know them, and at this point, with the way that internet discourse is, I think we all know what MLMs are. But from your Avon ladies, your Mary Kay ladies, to today your Beachbody representatives or your LuLaRoe consultants, they are companies that bring in consultants, business partners, what have you, and these consultants have to buy into the company, and then they sell stock or product at a commission. And this commission is important because it's the facade the whole thing is kind of built around. In the modern moment, you will likely see people compare it to affiliate marketing, which it isn't. I can't speak as an expert on affiliate marketing because while I do have affiliate links for bookshop.org that are usually in the description box and disclosed, the only commission I've made off of that is through a friend. So I'm not like actually making affiliate dollars. And if you regularly consume anti-MLM content, you have heard these talking points a lot at this point, including in the first season of The Dream. But the real money in these business ventures actually comes from recruiting other consultants. And it feels like the whole model of this has grown and snowballed exponentially in the internet age. If you are of a certain age, you remember going to Tupperware parties, to Long and Burger parties, to Pampered Chef parties, and those didn't feel as scammy because, granted, I was a child when I was going to those parties, and it always felt like it was about the products, and it was just an excuse to get together at a certain point. Now again, I wasn't even of an age where I could have been recruited, but it felt like the recruiting element wasn't quite as emphasized. Additionally, my grandma was an Avon lady back in the day, and I used to pore over those catalogs. I have friends who have been involved in MLMs, so while I am very interested in this subject matter and the psychology of it and the kind of cult think of it in a lot of ways, I again am not talking down to the people that are caught up in this, especially because again, these companies are often targeting people who are in need. They are hardworking people that see an opportunity and think because they are told if they just work hard enough, they can achieve this success, because of course they're hard workers, but they don't know at the outset that the deck is stacked against them. And again, often that ignorance isn't stupidity, but hope. For instance, the teacher who is roped into an MLM because they teach in a state that is notoriously one of the last in terms of teacher pay in the nation, and they need a little extra money. Those are the realities of this business model. And so I've been really interested in this for at least 5 years. My friends, if they are around, can sound off in the comments about how many tangents they have heard me go on about this because I find it so fascinating. So this book is really interesting because it is coming at a moment where we are seeing more books actually attacking this subject matter, like last year's Hey Hun. And it's coming from someone who was one of the first loud voices in the space in terms of this kind of reconsidering within the public conscious. Now, we've all probably had people slip into our DMs or been friended by that one person that you were sure didn't like you in high school, or like best case scenario was indifferent to your existence in order to pitch you something. Luckily, I've had a lot less cold messages than most. And even my acquaintances and friends that were actively selling at different points honestly didn't directly message me often. And there was a time a good portion of my Facebook feed was associated with particularly It Works in some way. Again, I don't want to come across disrespectful, especially to any of my friends or acquaintances that may have been involved in MLMs in the past. Again, there is no judgment there on my end. I'm just very interested in the subject matter. You're like, Melody, get to the book review. We do not care about you talking us through the 101 primer tangents of MLMs. I understand. So we are looking at this book that in some ways is penned by an expert on MLMs. And it's interesting because this podcast is so seminal, I think, to the space and to my own kind of media consumption around this topic. But if you didn't know that the Dream podcast existed, I don't think this book would really clue you into that fact. And it's interesting because the book does have to be updated. The first season came out in around 2018, which isn't that long ago, but we know that there was a great world event in the interim, and that great world event vastly changed the landscape of MLMs in that they started to boom, while coincidentally, the kind of pushback against the business model was also growing in volume. And so this book obviously in some way had to be updated from the podcast. And I don't think that this book should have just been the podcast regurgitated, to be clear, because you've got people like me that are coming in and wanting a little bit more. That being said, I don't know that this book really gives us the more, but it does serve a really important function in that it is kind of writing down a lot of the history of MLMs, going back to things like the beginning of Amway, which is very important in the modern conversation around MLMs, and most importantly, the modern conversation around prosecution of MLMs and what is possible there because of that case. So having that history written down is incredibly important because it collects a thing that hadn't existed collected in that way before. But at the same time, all of this was in the podcast. And so while that history is important, it doesn't really provide a new perspective to people like me who may be more familiar with the subject matter. And for people who are new to the subject matter, it is still important and interesting, but I don't know that it is presented in the best possible way, which gets us back to the idea of adaptation. Because we have this really important information and we do sprinkle anecdotes throughout, but it feels like it lacks a bit of a through line, whether narratively or focus-wise. That being said, the introduction really does lay out essentially the thesis of the book, so bear with me, I'm going to read that to you now. So it says, in these pages, you will learn how the industry preys upon the financially precarious, such as stay-at-home moms or undocumented or disabled workers, how the money at the top of more than one MLM can secure political power, how the shame and financial stress of being involved in an MLM can cost people their life savings and bankrupt their dreams even when it leaves them some savings. We'll answer why it is so hard for us to see a scam for what it is, what about our brains keeps us from admitting defeat, and why, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, the dominant narrative of MLMs is one of abundance and freedom from financial stress. So there is a lot to explore there. There is a lot really distilled in that paragraph, and all of these things are important to the conversation regarding how MLMs function in the modern moment and the promises that they are making to people and the reality of those promises. But we again are framing this through kind of like the history narratively seems to be the through line. Again, going back to like the beginning of Amway from the ashes essentially of Nutrilite, or kind of tracing the beginnings of Avon and Avon ladies. And we see more personal modern anecdotes sprinkled throughout. There's notably a whole little section talking about a pure romance consultant and how she kind of got her start in the industry, but we really do focus on that history section. And while we allude again to the things that bring people into these companies and the things that keep them in these companies, the behaviors of consultants in these companies, the kind of groupthink that is encouraged and whatnot, we don't really have that illustrated as strongly, which is fascinating to me because in the podcast, and granted it has been years since I listened to the first season, which I to this day think is unquestionably the strongest, there is a whole plot line essentially of the podcast where they join an MLM and kind of talk about the realities of it. They give it an honest go. And I do think there is a lot of fairness in the approach to MLMs in this book, especially because Jane Marie also comes from a small community where they are very prevalent, and she has family members that are involved in them, which she discloses to differing degrees. She does mention 31 bags at one point in this book, and I remember from the podcast her interviewing her, I believe, aunt, who was high up in that particular MLM at the time of the podcast's release, and like does not mention that at all while talking about that particular company having a product that is a little bit more actually valued by people or something that people use and want, which I find interesting because there feels like there is a little bit of a bias there, right? It also doesn't really acknowledge how like Christian influenced that particular MLM is. It may mention it, but it doesn't go into full depth. The book does talk about this, while I think it could have even gone further in relation to, especially, I don't think it ever names it outright, but this kind of prosperity gospel idea that is in so many of these companies that I really, really dislike. And it does talk about how MLMs really infiltrate religious communities and that they're really prevalent in churches, which I have seen. So it kind of grazes against a lot of these ideas and presents them, but doesn't feel like it ever really fully unpacks them, while also not illustrating it as cleanly as I think it could. Again, I think all of the ideas in here are important, and I do think they connect, and there is an attempt to illustrate these ideas through anecdotes. But I find it really interesting that she didn't ever even reference this attempt that was made in 2018 to actually sell for an MLM for journalistic purposes and the kind of findings of that, because it was seemingly a good faith attempt by her podcast partner, and maybe it comes down to the intellectual property of that and what Jane Marie herself owns versus like the production team, what have you. But I think that following that kind of narrative through line from joining a company to the disillusionment and the breakdown and the leaving and the shunning that often happens as a result of that could have been a really interesting way to thread a through line into the book in relation to all of this other stuff, all of the history, because each chapter really does attempt to talk about a larger conceptual topic within the kind of realm of MLMs, whether it be the real focus on women as consultants and really targeting women in MLMs, whether it be, again, the kind of prosperity gospel nature of a lot of this pitching, but also the intense capitalism and framing this as the American dream when most of these consultants are not going to realize any version of success, let alone the success that is being promised them. It talks about the mind games and manipulation that is at play, which I particularly find very interesting because if you have been with me for a second, you have probably heard me kind of side-eye, so I guess that's not heard, but I have been known to side-eye self-help as a genre because, as I have said before, I often find it very broad without specific action items, and it's just kind of empty platitudes. Those empty platitudes are going to be found a lot in this realm. So you've got other ideas such as like toxic positivity peeking its head into this book because that is definitely mentioned, but all of it, because there is so much at play, feels like we only touch on it for a moment. And as a reader, I came away more feeling or remembering the reading experience of the history of this, even the lobbying angle of this, which I found the most interesting when I first listened to the podcast and is definitely touched on in here. Didn't feel as deep as it was in that podcast. There, I believe they interviewed or had direct quotes from one of the representatives of the Direct Selling Association, the lobbying group association associated with MLMs. And we didn't have that here in the same way, which I found really interesting. And in that, a lot of the points feel kind of dulled. Additionally, we reference a couple of times, we spend a lot of the book talking about Amway, which makes sense because it is an influential giant of the industry, even if it is not particularly present in my own life in relation to MLMs, but it's incredibly important. Other than that, a couple of the companies that are referenced the most frequently throughout the book in relation to kind of modern MLMs are Herbalife and LuLaRoe, both of which notably have documentaries. Herbalife has Betting on Zero and LuLaRoe has LuLaRich. And so on one hand, I understand this because then it is a more common language to speak to with the reader. You can say, oh, I can point you to this other piece of media that is exploring this topic in a different way. And it's also a way of kind of citing things. So it's bringing that expertise in some ways. Additionally, because of these documentaries, both of these MLMs have a kind of touchstone in some way within the zeitgeist and the common kind of consciousness, because other MLMs that are referenced are, again, Amway, things like Avon, or how could I forget Young Living, which also at least has a couple of episodes of a Netflix documentary that talks about it, and it does talk pretty extensively about Young Living and doTERRA, the kind of other essential oil MLM in the game. And all of these companies have some level of notoriety or success in some way. And these are by no means the only companies that are mentioned in the book, but it is interesting to note how a lot of these companies kind of ebb and flow, and how that ebb and flow could potentially date the book just in terms of what MLMs are the most popular at any given moment, because based on the business model, a lot of them collapse in on themselves pretty quickly. And so we have that kind of duality there in terms of presenting things that are well known to the reader already potentially, but also still trying to present new information and new perspectives while not trying to date it too much. And I do think that there are a lot of examples that are brought into the book. I by no means want to say that it is not giving us that, but I really, as someone who is more familiar again with the subject matter, really wanted it to push further. And trying to take myself out of that familiarity and to view this with fresh eyes, I also felt, again, like it could have gone further in really emphasizing the points and using more evidence to make those points, whether it be anecdotal or really pointing us to more specifics of what is going on. And then using that to build to this bigger takeaway or to consistently reinforce that takeaway. And that is done here. Don't get me wrong. We really are looking at, based on that subtitle, the way these companies exploit this idealization of the American dream and the belief that anyone can achieve it. But when you strip everything away, it's usually just hucksters and charlatans on the other side, which at the end of the day, I think is actually a pretty apt distillation of that idea. But I think what it comes down to is that I haven't found the kind of ideal book that really tackles this subject matter for me. And to be fair, I realize that's kind of an unfair ask because there is so much to explore within this realm. There's so much to talk about that it just isn't going to be feasible. Here we have a book that really looks more at the history and the kind of cultural analysis of things. Would I have loved it to go more into the social and cultural analysis? Yes. And at the end of the day, maybe that is my main critique. But at the same time, we have books like Hey Hun that look more at some of the interpersonal dynamics at play within an MLM organization and what it takes to be at the top, what the cost is for those at the top and those in their downlines. But at the same time, that book wasn't quite perfect for me either, though I think that was me more feeling like the author wasn't always being completely genuine or taking complete ownership of her own actions within this structure. But yeah, I don't think there's the perfect book, but I think all of these books are very interesting additions to the conversation and are well worth your time. But at the end of the day, The Dream Season 1 exists for free on a podcast host near you. And so I think that I would still recommend that first because there is that narrative piece going on in that as well, and you still get the history. So if you do want to read this, which I'm not discouraging you from, but I would suggest you borrow rather than buy. And if you have thoughts on this, I would love to hear them below. I know I really just scratched the surface of all of this, which is kind of ironic considering my main critique is just feeling like we had just scratched the surface of all of this, but the surface has to be scratched to start the conversation, and I don't think that we can undermine how important it is to have these books as entries in the conversation in this more tangible way. So again, let me know what you're thinking. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. And yeah, bye.